Were you planning on presenting at all from the laptop?
I don't need to show anything.
Okay.
Can you just show anything?
Sweet. Sweet.
I'm still trying to figure out shade.
So I put up that other shade for,
Yeah. I mean, it's
Which-
still coming from the west later in the day. I told her that before she cut those trees down.
I told her the same thing. I was like, Joyce, you live in the desert.
Thank you, Summer.
Like it's gonna be sunny and you cut down all of the trees behind your home. And she was like, I just couldn't deal with mulberries. And I was like, I completely understand that. But there, before you cut them down, we had this talk. And then we put up more shade and we had this talk and yeah. I love your mom sometimes, but also like I put up the more shade and I had to reinforce that post and this, that, and the other.
Totally.
And she was like, well, the materials were so much. And I was like, first of all, they were not much. And I was like,
Yeah.
second of all, I'm not gonna build something that might break on you.
Yeah.
And put a post through your window, which is gonna be way more than you spent. on
Yeah,
it, you
totally.
know?
Right.
So, yeah.
I know, it's so funny. I mean, I get it. I do it all the time. She's a very like shoot from the hip kind of person sometimes.
Ready. I think we are ready.
Intelligent and very
Whenever you guys
methodical,
are.
but then sometimes she'll just decide that something.
Sometimes I
has
try to
happen.
slow it down too, and I'm like, Joyce, like, just think about this for a while, and then like get back to me. And
Yeah.
if you still feel strongly about this in a month, like we can do it. But
Totally.
you know, this may be a little bit of
Totally.
a jump decision.
But
here.
like, that's a great idea. You can make
Well,
that
yeah,
work.
that's what I pitched her. I was like, we can make that work.
Yeah.
You know,
Oh, funny. So funny. No, I'm not surprised by that at all. That's why her and Aaron jive so well, because we're sort of second that way. And you and I are a little bit more.
it was nice to see Odie though.
What?
It was nice to see the pup though. So cute. Oh my
She's so
God.
sweet. She's so funny.
It's this tiny little.
guys, we're ready.
being-
When you are.
Snuggle torpedo. So we're just talking about my mom's new dog. Yeah.
Yeah, she's adorable.
She was always running wild.
Dog talk,
Must
yeah. Okay, woohoo, here we go.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead and get her started.
Whenever we're ready.
Oh, are we recording?
Oh, well, everyone gets to hear about my mom's new dog.
Then we're ready. Ready.
Okay. That's funny. You should warn us next time.
Was the shouting voice?
Oh, wow. I'm not with it today. Cool, we can cut that in post. All right, I call to order this Thursday, April 11th, 2024 meeting of the Moab City Planning Commission at 6:03 p.m. In attendance, we have planning commissioners Jill Tatton, Miles Lofton, Carolyn Conant, myself, Kai Marienfeld. We also have city staff Corey Shirtleff, Bryce, Anna, and Michael. We have our city council liaison Luke Wojciechowski, and we have the applicants for the agenda item tonight in the audience. We have Karen Locke and wait, Kaiser. Okay, I was like, I know your first name. Let me get the last name. Courtney Kaiser here representing the applicant as well. Okay, first item of business is citizens to be heard. This would be on things not on our agenda for the evening. We did get, what did we get? We got revisions from the applicant, not any public comment. Okay, great. I don't believe we received any emails or anything through the city's comment portal about anything regarding citizens to be heard. Nor is anyone in chambers who is not involved with the action item tonight. So we can move on. Next, we have approval of minutes from our March meetings, March 14th and March 21st. That need approval. That was a regular meeting on the 14th and then a special meeting on the 21st. That we held here. Has anyone had a chance to look at those and make sure that they
So I read through the minutes for both meetings. It seems like everything that we tabled from the March 14th has been corrected and it seems to say what we wanted to say. So
Great.
pretty happy with
After
it.
those corrections we made.
Yep.
Yep.
And then the 21st seemed pretty straightforward.
Great. Yeah, important. I
I
think
think
that
he
we
was really on it for the 21st. To
accurately-
make sure that one was very clean. and accurate.
capture
Yeah.
the meeting.
Yeah.
I
I think there were maybe one or two minor edits that I baked in.
Okay.
That weren't consequential, so.
Great.
No need to.
appreciate
elaborate
that,
too
Corey.
much, but-
Thank you. Okay, we can entertain a motion on those.
I'm happy to motion to approve the minutes from the March 14th, 2024 regular meeting and the minutes from the March 21st, 2024 regular meeting,
Special.
special meeting.
Doesn't matter.
Sorry.
We have a motion to approve those minutes from Miles. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Okay, Carolyn, thank you for seconding. Any discussion before we take a vote? Thanks, Corey, for being so thorough in that. We really appreciate
That
it.
was super diligent, Brad.
And Eve, as always, for being our woman behind the curtain. Okay, I would just say, all in favor of approving those 2 minutes from our March meeting, say aye.
Aye.
Aye, okay, motion passes unanimously. All right, next we have our discussion item for the evening, which is 4.1, a discussion on proposed development code text amendment application for the National Ability Center, which is creating and defining new permitted use and ancillary use for nonprofit outfitter and guide services with community benefit overnight accommodations. Take it away.
Perfect, thank you. We do have
Oh.
additional applicant members, both, the National Ability Center, NAC team, as well as Courtney Kaiser's, kind of the submitting applicant. So we do have really the whole team for this discussion item, which is going to be really great for us to get into the details of those. So for everyone jumping on, thank you so much for joining us, Tracy, Jeff, Brian, and Dallas. Thank you so much. So just to be aware of how our Zoom meetings work, we can see you if your video is on. If your video is off, we cannot actually see you in the chambers. And then obviously, if just for sake of noise, if when you're wanting to make comments, obviously come off mute, but go back onto mute if you're not making comments, just to reduce feedback and noise in the chambers here. But just a really brief introduction of the item given by Kaya, and now about to move just kind of into what will be a pretty open format discussion item. Through that, though, we've coordinated with the applicant team to provide a little bit of structure how we'd like to get the commission up to speed with where we're at with some of this text amendment. But to begin kind of within that introduction, I think Jeff and I think maybe Brian were going to prepare some or maybe Karen. One of the team members was going to give us kind of the introductory of to who NAC is, why their mission is important to Moab, and then also why this text amendment is coming before you as an important aspect of them moving forward with their business expanding. So I'll hand it over for now to the applicant team. And I guess I should say, following this introduction, I thought we might also hear from Courtney as far as the language construction that was actually used, both in what was the original application and then some of the updates that you got yesterday. And then following that, maybe you have the opportunity for the commission to actually engage at that point. And then Michael and I will probably fill in the blanks once the commission is starting to engage, where we can have questions with the applicants, but then also advisory discussion from staff of how we see this going as well. So again, very open format where we can plug into any part at any time. So anyway, Jeff or Brian or
yeah, I'll take it away. So hello everyone. I'm Jeff Fonz. I'm with the National Ability Center. I'm the Chief Operating Officer. We've got a couple of folks. We'll do very quick introductions, and then Karen Locke is going to take you through a little bit of more of the background of why this is so important for us and the benefits it can offer both to the NAC, the people we serve, and to the city of Moab as well. So I'll turn it over. I'll do a quick introduction. Dallas Green is on with us as well. He's our Senior Manager of Facilities. And then I'll turn it over to Brian, Tracy, and Karen to do introductions. At the end of when Karen gives you a little bit of an overview, Courtney's going to walk us through some additional verbiage and thoughts on how we can make this a win-win. So yeah, as it was mentioned, we just want to make this a discussion and tell you why we think this is important and get your guidance on how we could help move something like this forward.
Well, thank you, Jeff. We started because you were very loud here in chambers. For whatever reason, I think Corey and Bryce were figuring that out, but we were just so yeah, and Corey, feel free to sort of lead queuing everybody and stuff too. So as far as the applicant.
Did you need me to repeat anything or
No.
can we move on? Okay, all right. I'm done screaming at you for now. So
No,
I'll
that's
turn it
good.
over to Brian. I'll turn it over to Brian.
Gotcha.
Perfect. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, everyone. Can you hear me at a decent decibel?
Yes.
My name is Brian Essig. I am the Associate Program Director here at the National Ability Center. I lived in Moab on and off for about 6 years, from 2014 to 2020. Was a guide and a manager down at Western River Expeditions before coming into the adaptive world at the NAC. And yeah, right now I get to work with a lot of our program team, and I specifically work with our groups that come down to Moab and then also come and ski up here in Park City.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tracy Meyer. I'm the Chief Program and Education Officer at the National Ability Center. Sorry that we're not all there in person with you. And Karen, alone there all by yourself, girlfriend, we got your back. I've had 22 years as a privilege of serving people with disabilities through the National Ability Center programs and have been a certified therapeutic recreation specialist nationally and through the state of Utah for 22 years. So love to share what our programs do and really appreciate the opportunity to talk to y'all tonight about some great opportunities for people with disabilities. All right, Karen, take us away.
Hello, I am Karen Locke. I am the Southern Utah Senior Program Manager for the National Ability Center. So I am the head manager down here. Tracy is my boss. They're all up in Park City enjoying the snow while we're getting ready for our season down here. I've seen all of your faces before. I've been around for about 8 years. This is my 8th season with the National Ability Center. And I've just been asked to give a brief overview of our program. So we are a nonprofit. I'm going to have Brian start a short PowerPoint.
Karen, I might ask you to just move the mic a little closer and up. You can tilt it up.
I'm not used to this.
So people on YouTube can hear, and then our folks taking minutes also will listen. So
Perfect.
thank you.
So like I said, I am Southern Utah Senior Program Manager, and I help run the nonprofit programs down here in Moab. We have a mission statement. We empower individuals of all abilities by building self-esteem, confidence, and lifetime skills through sport, recreation, and educational programs. And that's what drives us every single day. This lovely picture here is a picture of us on Gates of Lodore with a group of men with traumatic brain injuries. One of my favorite photos of all time. Most of the folks on this trip had quadriplegia. So most of you probably know about SPLOR. SPLOR was started here about 47 years ago in Moab. In 2017, my first season, NAC and SPLOR partnered up. They merged to join and kind of, keep the dream going, keep the mission statement going. We didn't change a whole lot. We still cater to the same individuals. And, around town, a lot of people know us as SPLOR. We've had a lot of connections with different nonprofits here in town. So it's really nice to keep that going as well. We, as a National Ability Center, we provide low-cost experiences for people with disabilities. We cater to about 600 to 700 individuals here in Moab each season. That's from May until October. And about 34% of our trips are scholarships. So we do low-cost expeditions, and we also do, scholarships for those who can't afford it, and grants as well on top of that. Just a little background of our programming. So we serve lots of different populations. Most of the populations that we serve are adults. We serve the autism community, the deaf and visual impairment community. We have a great trip every single year with Utah School for the Deaf and Blind, and it's kids who are deaf, and it's a wonderful trip. We take them down Desolation Canyon for 6 days. We serve a lot of veterans. About 30% of our population is veterans, so that could, be a mix of disabilities. That could be physical disabilities, limb differences, things like traumatic brain injuries, PTSD, of course, things like that, some invisible injuries there as well. And then we serve folks with traumatic brain injuries, and we serve a lot of folks with paraplegia and quadriplegia. Because of the populations that we serve, we obviously have to have a higher level of training for all of our staff. We are a small team, but we do expect a lot out of our team. So all of our full-time staff are required to be wilderness first responders or EMTs. We always have an EMT on staff, not on every expedition, but on staff. I'm an EMT, and we have a couple staff who are EMT as well. We do an ability awareness training and transfer training. That's something that's very specific to the disability community. And I've started reaching out in the last few years and working with other nonprofits in town. So we give ability awareness and transfer training to Canyonlands Fields Institute every year. And I just partnered with Seek Haven, which I'm very excited about, to trade some training back and forth. We do provide swiftwater rescue. So obviously, the traditional guide training and all the things that we're doing with our participants. Of course, we provide training on that, and then rescue training as well. And then I am really big on continued education for our staff. So we see a variety of different disabilities. And if our staff are trained in April, in July, we might have a new group coming with a disability that we haven't seen before. And so it's important for us to touch base back on it. So continuous training. And we really do expect a lot out of our staff as well. Brian, can you go to the next slide? Just a couple quick stories, just a couple quick personal photos I wanted to share with y'all. We do, like I said, a variety of different trips. The photo in the bottom left is a veterans trip that was during some COVID times. And then the picture in the top right is my buddy Jordan. Jordan has Friedreich's ataxia. We do a trip with folks with Friedreich's ataxia every year, and it's an inherited disease that is degenerative. So people are typically getting worse as they get older, or losing less function as they get older. So we are providing basic help here and there. We're helping to feed people. We don't change people per se, but we've definitely been there as friends and as companions along the way to help people. And Jordan has been rafting and doing expeditions with SPLOR and the NAC for about 6 years. So yeah, he's a wonderful participant of ours. It is one of the only things that gets him out of his home. So yeah, we're very, very happy to see him every year. He looks forward to it. And then before we go to the next slide, we did a podcast 2 years ago and with the River Radius, and we talked about the dignity of risk, which is something that is really important to us. And we interviewed this lady, Eleanor, who is part of TURN. And if the audio works, we're going to go to the next slide, and she's going to explain she's about a 90-second clip of her experience with the National Ability Center and SPLOR and what we do. Oh.
The value of this trip long term for the people at TURN.
Realizing that you can do something that you didn't think you could do, possibly for some folks, knowing that you are a river runner, a new identity, not just the person with a disability or the person who's on supported deployment. If you fall out of the boat, knowing that you survived, knowing that you can do stuff that you didn't think you could do. And I think just general self-esteem, it's something different than who they thought they were. There's a young man who was involved in a shooting, had a brain injury. And when he first started coming to TURN, he was pretty upset about that. He's someone who lives home with his mother, so he gets to do a lot of things, but not the same opportunities as some other folks might have. But he has changed significantly. He's not thinking about tossing himself out of the van at the end of the trip. He's not as depressed. He's much more social. He's able to do more things physically and wanted. At first, he didn't really care so much about the physical part. And then because he wanted to do things like river trips, he started exercising more and and working harder on the things he needed to be able to transfer himself and do more of it himself.
So from your perspective, from your 37 years of time doing this,
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, so that's a quick breath of what we do as far as our program down here. Brian's going to talk about the challenges we face, and then I'm open to talking about some different things when we open it up for questions.
Thanks, Karen. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yes.
Perfect. So yeah, just wanted to touch base on a couple of the challenges that we have currently with the participants that we serve in Moab. A lot of our groups come down, and just logistics wise, not having a property that we can meet for location wise, we meet a lot of our groups at takeout. As all you know, not very good service of any service at all at takeout. So communication before the trip, and then we've got guides, we've got our whole trip up the canyon when we meet at takeout. We're hoping that they're going to meet at the same time and that we can get all of our trip going and the whole logistics. Not to mention when we get to the river, if we have participants that use wheelchairs, transferring them into the boats. It is a slower process than I've seen in most river companies, but we get it done. It is a little bit of a hardship to meet at that one location and not have a place where we can meet in town necessarily. Another thing is we have groups that come down. Some of our groups come down and they raft with us for the day, and then they drive back up to Salt Lake City that night. Few reasons for that. One of them is it's hard to find accessible rooms in Moab. It's hard to find cheap accessible rooms in Moab as well. We have, like Karen said, quite a few of our participants are scholarshiped. Overall, our organization scholarships almost $700,000 a year to our participants for them to be able to come to our programs. And it's the only reason that they can come on these river trips and they can have these experiences. Just a couple of the hardships that we face. We do get it done year after year. We run almost 700 people down the river every single year. But just kind of shining a light on some of the things that we deal with that I think some of the other outfitters and other companies in town don't deal with.
And you want to touch on the group you were going to bring that was going to stay at the hotel because we were looking for additional lodging?
Yeah, that's something. We have a lot of groups that come up and stay in Park City for a few days. And then we head down and go on a river trip. This group in particular that we're bringing out this summer has 6 wheelchair users, which is definitely a large group that we would bring down as far as amount of wheelchair users. But we called a few hotels in town. They said, oh yeah, of course, we've got accessible rooms. We'd love to accommodate. And then we tell them how many that we want to bring out. And they're like, oh, that's actually way too many. We don't have that many roll-in showers. We don't have that many accessible rooms. So yeah, we've reached out to quite a few of the hotels in town, and having accessible lodging or accessible rooms for them to stay in, especially if we bring a large group, which we have plenty of groups that we're bringing at least 6 people that use wheelchairs down. It is definitely a hassle to try to find where they can all stay in one place and then they can all use a roll-in shower at night. I think we wanted to also give some time to Courtney to talk a little bit about the bigger words and that we don't understand as much about this amendment as well.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Courtney Kaiser. I'm an architect here in town, and I've been helping the NAC figure out how to achieve their goals. And thank you, Karen, Brian, and Jeff, for sharing why we're all sitting here today. Our goal with this code change is to appropriately differentiate the NAC programs from existing commercial outdoor recreation outfitters and guide services that will create a pathway for a specific set of spaces they need to do their work. That's the overarching goal. And the things that we believe we need to do in order to achieve that goal are create a use that encompasses the NAC, create an ancillary use that allows for the specific short-term accommodation, create a criteria for who can utilize those short-term accommodations, and determine any other uses that would benefit from these specialized short-term accommodation types. So those are the 4 reasons behind the code that you've seen so far. There's a few specific items that we'd like your temperature on today. And these have been raised as sticky points as we've been talking through and massaging the code with conversations with staff. So the first goes back to the definition of the NAC. The new definition that we've proposed aligns with the state code section that dictates recreational therapy licensure, but we are open to other ideas and tweaks that would get us to the same goal in a way that makes the city comfortable. Second is in the qualifying participant definition. One of the items on this list that's come into question is the section regarding disability. Although this opens the door slightly, we feel like this is a really critical supporting item for the NAC specifically. And for all of the reasons that they just shared, the types of participants that are coming to their program, they meet a legal definition of disability. And how do we make sure that we encompass all of their participants? The third thing is other community uses. So in the revision that you received today or yesterday, we did reduce the number of community uses that we were proposing. But there's a handful of other community support or critical mission-based nonprofits that could take advantage of this. The first one that comes to mind is the hospital. What they've shared with me in the past is that they have visiting or traveling staff or family members of patients who may require short-term accommodations. Their proximity to the hospital is critical and appropriate hotel rooms are not always available. Those staff and family members represent a community benefit in a very different way than a tourist staying in a hotel. Yet the current code does not differentiate between them. Another example is Seek Haven. They have a growing need to shelter victims of abuse, and the timelines for their stays frequently fall into the short-term accommodations category. The group home definition in our code falls short of their needs due to a limitation on the number of beds they can provide. This code section presents a potential opportunity to encompass their needs as well. The fourth thing that I'd really like to hear your thoughts on today is long-term use. So these units could provide more much needed housing when they're not in use for the program participants. It would be a shame for them to just sit empty all winter, for example. It has been suggested that there's a path to that, but perhaps the units would need to meet the requirements of the underlying zone, which seems like a really great idea. The only niggle for the NAC is that due to the necessity of having all sleeping and living spaces on the ground level, that prevents the underlying use of the C3 from working for them, because long-term living units have to be on the upper floors unless they meet a pretty narrow definition. So those are the main things on my mind. Thank you so much for your consideration. And of course, if there's anything else that we propose that causes you heartburn, we would love to talk through it. We appreciate your input and thoughts. So thank you for your time and collaboration.
Thanks, Courtney.
Thank you.
Notes. All right, Corey, do you have anything to add to sort of the?
Sure. I think Jeff came off mute, and I didn't want to give any opportunity for anybody else from the NAC team to kind of jump into this as we're coming to the close, I think, of the presentation materials and into discussion. But yeah, anything else, Jeff, that you wanted to add, or anybody else, Brian or Tracy?
I'd love to get your insights. Like we kind of talked about this being a discussion. You guys are experts in this space, and we know that changing code is something that you don't take lightly, and we want to see if we can find the right ground that allows us to serve our participant population without opening up loopholes for others that maybe you wouldn't want to take advantage of a new code in some way, shape, or form. And so I'd love to have your insights on things that you're concerned about, areas that you might have suggestions for, et cetera.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jeff.
Perfect. I do think that is actually a really nice transition to what I was intending as kind of this next aspect, was for the commission to, within the research that you've done with the initial application and then with the additional submitted materials, any major concepts that we want to kind of get out onto the table ahead of what I will be doing is sharing a presentation that is just showing the language so that we can actually all walk through it together and see the actual language. But before we get into that, any major concepts that we wanted to throw out, or concerns, questions, anything else?
No, I mean, I think just based on the presentation, I will say this is near and dear to my heart as well. In a past life, I was a guide for an organization based in the Midwest that did inclusion-based trips with both people with disabilities and able-bodied people. Wilderness Inquiry, you may be familiar with it. I worked for WI for a good long time. And so everything you're talking about with transfer training and agency and the, everything with risk, it's cool. I'm having all of these like cool flashbacks to a lot of my experience as a guide with them. So it's really neat to see and hear about all the work that you guys do. I wholeheartedly believe in its importance, and also just as much for all the able-bodied people on the trips and for staff as well. I think I've benefited way more than our participants really ever did. So
You're welcome to be a volunteer. We accept volunteers.
I should say I went to law school after that, and I no longer have time, unfortunately, but but I'm happy to excited to try to work with you guys and do what we can as a planning commission to figure out some way to hopefully make this work. My biggest sort of maybe red flag that kind of rose for me just based on the presentation is, man, I sure do not want to get into the business of having to define what is a disability and what isn't. That really, I think, is a very slippery slope. And I think if we're looking down the barrel of opening this up to things we don't want to open it up to, that would probably be the mechanism where I could see there being some real heartache in the future, where we obviously are not in a position and do not want to put the city in the position of having to say this disability counts and this disability doesn't count. And if you're under this category, yes. And if you're under this category, no. So any way we can stay away from that, that may not be possible, but man, that would sure make it a lot easier. And I think more defensible, frankly, in the future, if there's a way we can define the use, not the users.
If we want, because that is one of the points I was hoping that we were going to cover later. So I think we can certainly put a pin in that and anticipate circling back to that once we get to some of the code language. Where there may be a good opportunity for some back and forth is to getting to the root of what is needed out of this particular business or any other users that will qualify, and see if we can't get that mechanism done a different way. So I think we'll put a pin in that. That's
Cool.
an important flag that I think we had as well.
Anybody else have sort of initial things to maybe try to kick off things in a direction that's productive?
Well, as the special ed director for the school district, I think this is a fabulous facility for people with disabilities. It's something that I do every day with the school system. So yeah, I want to steer clear of the Individuals with Disabilities Act. We always follow the IDEA. But yeah, there's gray areas, and I don't want to be the one that defines that, because yeah, that's a lot. But I think this is fabulous. Yeah, as we go further into our discussions, I know on your amendment, you did list schools, but you didn't address schools. So I'm wondering if also, as we go forward, how can we incorporate some of our super seniors that I know for a fact haven't done anything like this? How can we work together as well to include our local students and people in the community with this? Because there's not a group home, there's not places for them to live. And, how can we help get them into this once a year and see how we can connect as well? So.
Yeah, I think Tracy could talk to a number of things on anything from camps to serving certain groups. Up at our main campus, we do a lot of different services for different groups. Like one of them is called Park City Adult Lifelong Learning, or PC All, which is folks with folks on the spectrum that have aged out of the normal support system. And so we get the opportunity to bring them in and teach them lifelong skills and have certain camps that could be a day camp or it could be an overnight camp type of scenario. So in the ideal world, we could use that to support some of the work you do with the populations you support as well.
And
And give them
connecting some
opportunities that
people.
maybe they wouldn't have.
Yeah, connecting some people with other people. I think it's a fabulous idea. So making lifelong friends for these people that come to enjoy Explore. That's what I know it as, Explore.
Carolyn, Miles, any initial thoughts before we start to kick it off?
A lot of it's the same. I have also spent some time seeing firsthand the benefit of this kind of work and the benefit of what Whitewater can do for people of differing abilities, and it's wonderful, and I'm very much in support of that. Housing is delicate in town, and making sure that if we can provide the right folks the ability to use this. I love the idea that it might spill into helping Sea Haven as well. There are a lot of groups here in town who do a lot of good work for our community that could benefit from something like this, but just making sure that there aren't loopholes that we're building in. I agree with Kaya very much in the sense that I don't want to define what a disability is or which ones are allowable and which ones aren't. I think if we can change the language so that we can allow a use for you guys and for other people who really are trying to build something that works with the community without having to define that, I think that would be excellent.
Carolyn?
Agree with what others have said so far, and I also appreciate how you're kind of bringing the perspective of trying to advocate for other similar kind of mission-oriented nonprofits in town to look for a code change that will benefit others besides National Ability Center. So really appreciate that kind of thoughtfulness for a larger community approach.
Well, that's huge. And I know firsthand some of the issues that Sea Haven in particular has run into trying to expand their housing services and their shelter services. It's just like some pretty big non-conforming use issues and X, Y, and Z. And it's kind of an interminable thing, it seems like. So it'd be neat to try to thread the needle and figure out something that could work for all of these organizations that I think roundly have community support to do so. So yeah, definitely. All right, Corey.
Yeah, perhaps, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Jeff, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say perhaps somebody with a law degree and a history of working with folks with disability could help us navigate that and figure out the right language.
All right. So, this is, I am a citizen planner. I will say the planning staff here at Moab City are most excellent, and we trust them to lead us into the wilderness.
All right.
Speaking of, Corey, what do you need from us?
Thank you all. This is where we may start some of our back and forth dialogue a little bit. So a little bit of additional background to show for us. Perfect. Where we're coming from. This is just the goal statement that was established on the original application. So nothing in writing you haven't seen before, but within this vicinity map showing you the areas specific to NEC that we're talking about. But again, this is a text amendment. So we're really not looking at a particular property or a particular development, none of the specifics there. But what I think informs the rest of this story is the NAC and Courtney coming towards the city with the potential for an annexation process. And then through that, coming into the city, how we might actually approach fitting their use into the category. So outfitters and guide services currently are not permitted use in C3 anyway. So even if we were to have been maybe under the original umbrella of something of that nature, that would have been an additional amendment needing to be made. But to be a little bit more specific and then also expand what is this ancillary component, which is kind of the bigger grab here. I think what we're doing with the use definition is just establishing that NEC makes sense to be in the area that they already are operating, but just within city limits as opposed to the county. And then allowing them to be permitted would allow for redevelopment without that non-conforming use status locking them in. So really with that established, it was this ancillary component of the short-term lodging for its participants that was really the bigger push of what this conversation is going to be unique to. Michael, anything else of kind of the history of how we've gotten to this point?
Yeah, first of all, I'm Michael Black. I'm the Community Development Director for the record. And thanks for letting me sit up here tonight. I appreciate it. So, just a little bit more information. You know, the city has adopted policies in the last several years that are specifically related to overnight accommodations. But when you have somebody who comes in and presents a community use that's so important like this one, we want to see what we can do. And that's why we've been talking with them, working with them. And we actually suggested that they submit a text amendment. We said this is something that we could look at with our code amendment, but it probably won't work as fast. It would work quicker if you did a text amendment yourself. And that's why we're here. So we definitely, I think you're on the right track. I want to say that. I think everyone understands what we're doing here, but I just want to make it really clear that staff is here looking for solutions, and we need help brainstorming how we can work with this to see if this could potentially work, allowing for the things that are important to a community like ours, any community, to allow for these types of things, but not to open the door so wide that others could potentially use it and get around these other policies that have been adopted about short-term rentals, overnight accommodations. So, and I'm just here to assist Corey, really. Corey's been lead on this. I've been trying to help him out.
Perfect. So to swing kind of into the back end of that, of where after this discussion item, it's very likely that we'll coordinate with the applicant team again in advancing some kind of more formalized and official submittal materials that will probably come to you in a public hearing.
Yeah.
Through that text amendment process. But then with the NAC, again, this bigger scope picture is that they'll probably also be bundling this potentially with a possible pre-annexation agreement at the time of this code amendment. So as they go to city council, they understand is if this use were to be accepted just in this one item, immediately after that, that would give them the opportunity to potentially annex the city or engage in a pre-annexation agreement. But if this amendment were to not be approved by city council, there is really not much sense in pursuing the annexation, as in that the permitted use basis wouldn't be there. So we kind of get frozen out. So it's going to be a very dynamic process for them, but for us, it really is kind of the standard text amendment process and public hearing. So getting into the language now. Again, this is taken directly from the new language that was submitted to you guys yesterday, broken into from a code developer's perspective, the different framing elements. So that's what the bullet points really are versus reading maybe more like a paragraph. So what we're establishing first is the use itself, the name of what it is that we're talking about. And that's been amended a little bit, amended quite a bit from the first application, but as we've been working with the applicants, there was a little bit of refinement coming to you at this point. So we need to be looking at each, and this is when we're doing ordinance development, each word and the language used is very important. So we are trying not to use superfluous language or maybe potentially misleading language. It has to be simple enough to cover what it is that we're looking for, is accurate enough to cover what we're looking for, but also simple enough is to not leave the door open or accidentally close the door on something else that we are looking for. So the aspects of just this use term is nonprofit, recreational therapy service provider, if you can kind of think about it broken into those elements. So this is a pretty big bundle for a single use,
It's huge.
but it does get to, I think, the point of what it is that NAC in particular is trying to do. We'll come back to a pin on what I may consider kind of some of our staff concept recommendations on the back end of this, but I don't want to get too much into kind of nitpicking at this point. But through the definition, again, as Courtney mentioned, this was taken, and Courtney, I was looking up this specific language. It was brought into a little bit of a hybrid along with some of our other language. So we've been through this process working into what is it the most recognizable and, for lack of a better term, official definition term that we can pull from, whether it's university programs, qualifying and credentialing programs, so that all of this language, while it might not be stuff that's in our code currently, like psychoeducational, is something that is particularly that use that is an important factor to maybe be qualifying some of these things. So this definition to attach to the use, I think is in pretty good shape as to what is regionally and nationally accepted. Specifically citing Utah State Code. So moving beyond that, again, that was kind of stage one, not too complex there. Make sure that we just have the right use to start with, or what I'll call the banner use. Now moving on to this ancillary component, short-term lodging for qualifying participants. This was originally kind of a draft language, just trying to get to the essence of what it is we're talking about. And it's really met the litmus test at each stage of actually being sufficient. So we're, I think, all of us very open to negotiating some of the terminology in this name. But it really does get to some of what our existing language holds. So we have pre-definitions already designed around short-term lodging, and then qualifying participants is kind of self-explanatory to what in the criteria we're attributing to it. So I think we can move right on to what the definition is explaining here.
Well, and Corey, that might be where we diverge, and instead of qualifying participants, qualified uses. So we're not, if you meet that former definition, the one that was on the former page, then your primary use, according to that, is providing all those services. So your primary customer is going to fit those qualifications according to that. So you don't need to, potentially don't need to call it out there.
That
Mission.
I think, and that's a really good observation. I think if we're approaching it from an NAC perspective, I think that aligns pretty well. If the idea is all of a sudden that we're moving over into group home and schools and other things, that's where the qualifying language here might get. That's what makes this challenging. Is if we're doing an ancillary use for one particular use, it could be pretty linear. But as we start trying to broaden that scope, which was part of the original intent, making sure that so if it was short-term lodging for qualifying programs, the program, a school, for instance, would be qualifying, but then how they define some of the criteria maybe gets interesting. But again, this is why this is a discussion, and it'll thankfully be all on the record. So when we go back, we can take really good notes. So I think that's a point well taken. The main definition here is a living or sleeping unit which adheres to the following. Kind of the idea is it's a short-term unit. I don't want to call it rental, but short-term unit for lodging. Lodging being a slightly different use definition than overnight accommodations, short-term rental, STRs, those type of other things that we have in our code, guest apartments. But really relying on the criteria here. So these were tweaked a little bit, again, even from the original application and then a little bit from our previous applications with staff. Mostly, I think we're all in alignment that these are fairly accurate. There were some things that were removed that were a little bit broader reaching, but again, trying not to open the door to too much of a flexibility that can be abused in a situation. I think everything except for what is maybe we've discussed tonight is an individual with disability defined by such. This was something that we're getting back to the discussion format. If the applicant team, the reason for including this, if we included it in this location in this way, it would essentially say that a qualifying person of disabilities, regardless if they're participating in your program, could stay there. Now, if that's the intent, okay, we can have that conversation. But the provision above that saying they have to be a qualified participant in your program, well, if that, whatever it is that they need to do to qualify for your program, we're just going to say that's good enough for the city. We don't need to know where or how they're being qualified within their disability. So unless the intent was to have, for lack of a better term, just some tourist that has qualifying disabilities come and stay there, that's the only reason to include it in this language in this way. Otherwise, you could strike it and still maintain that criteria of the program. But I think from the applicant team, the idea of their participants trying to eliminate the hacker option. We used this idea of hacker recently, and it was kind of brought up, it was kind of pretty apt, is to prevent things from being manipulated or abused. So I think they're really trying to pack as much as they could into this definition. But again, we don't want to be so descriptive that we're actually creating more hurdles. So I'll pause there and maybe we can have the discussion.
I will say that at least from my perspective, one, going off what Kaya said, I think it would be much better to limit it to someone who is attending the program that you guys are offering. That seems like a fine definition to me. Then we don't have to define what a disability is, because essentially your program does that for us. The fact that they are participating in your program probably means that they qualify in one way or another. And again, like you said, I think that the spirit of what we're going for is exactly that someone participating in your program is able to stay here, not that we are allowing a caveat for lodging specifically for people with disabilities, whether or not they're involved in your program. And then when I think about like Sea Haven or something like that as well, if the definition was someone participating in their program, that would make a lot more sense to me than having that added definition of an individual with disabilities. So both not wanting to define that and both wanting to accommodate people who are involved in your program in one way or another. I definitely think striking that sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah, you said something. I want to highlight it, make sure everyone caught it because it was kind of quick. Sea Haven, very specific participation.
Mhm.
If we were to write it the way it's kind of currently written, and I don't want to beat a dead horse, but that's what we're saying is that anybody off the street, if they're qualifying, could say, well, I can stay here. Obviously, Sea Haven would have to permit it, but it does start to dabble into, well, that's not the intent. But I don't think that was, and this is where I want to check in with the applicant team, that was that in the intent, is to just create, because when we start talking about housing, we will start talking about trying to broaden the community of opportunity for housing. So was that the intent, or is it more to kind of double it down on making sure the criteria of your participants is represented? And that can be Jeff or anybody who's welcome to chime in.
So it sounds more like we're trying to qualify, if we qualify the organization, the National Ability Center, and what we do, we're allowed to then bring in participants that we would normally serve, as opposed to having you and getting into that trap door of, hey, who's got a disability? Your disability is applicable, your disability is not. We can make that determination of, are they a participant that we would normally serve in our programs anywhere in the state or anywhere else we might operate? Is that what I'm hearing?
Correct.
Tracy.
Yeah, which we've been doing for almost 40 years, and so we've had to manage that up here in Park City with those people trying to, weasel their way in, for lack of a better term. And so we do have that historical perspective of what does our evaluation look like? What is the information we're gathering to determine diagnosis and support needed to determine if someone is appropriate for programming. So that is something that I feel like makes sense to fall onto us and not onto the city to have to determine.
Well, in the same way that Sea Haven has criteria for people that qualify to receive shelter services. And that's their own criteria that they have and apply to people. So, I mean, I like that too. I like the idea of it being something where it's, if the primary purpose of whatever the entity or the property owner is, I think that's really important. I think what worries me about opening the door too wide is, for example, there are many guide organizations in town that do a one-off trip every year with a group of kids in a special ed program at the school, with a group of trauma survivors, which is all wonderful, wonderful work. But I feel like it's if you are an entity providing this specific set of services, and that's your primary use of both your organizational structure and your property, and then for people that qualify under that definition rather than the other way around. I feel like it's if this, then this, and you have to meet both criteria. But the first one being the organization or the entity itself needs to have sort of the bigger umbrella, instead of saying if you are a person with disabilities or with some sort of emotional or psychotrauma or something like that, and then an organization. I feel like it almost makes sense to flip that.
And we're a nonprofit as well. So, I mean, there's the nonprofit elements with our, as Corey's highlighting here, we primarily do this. And you saw what Karen shared for the training that our guides and our instructors are required to go through and on ongoing continuing education. So I think there's a couple of opportunities to say, look, this is not that one-off trip for that great, philanthropic opportunity for each of the guide services. I think it's great that everybody, does some of that every once in a while, but as our primary function, what we do every single day, we train and hire specifically for these needs. I think those can help to serve to shore it up a little bit.
I will say the nonprofit title and determination is, I don't find that to be at all separating anything out. I feel like that is such a broad umbrella that almost is superfluous at a certain point, where you've got, I mean, you can look through a list of what the registered nonprofits are in Moab, and you would be like floored by some entities that are nonprofits. And so I feel like even that almost seems like such a non thing as far as like a determinative criteria at this point. It's such a huge umbrella that anything based on that would be a really wide door to open. And I say that as an employee of a nonprofit, but like, yeah, it's too big. That's way too big.
Yeah, Corey.
Okay.
Could you unhighlight that for a minute? So we
Yeah.
can see the rest of it.
That got kind of goofy.
Yeah,
Let's see
what-
if it goes back.
There's
to-
something about,
So, yeah, this is maintained, was the primarily plans, was one of the elements that was added to that aspect of what it is that you're doing. If you have a one-off trip like that's being discussed, when you're establishing that business model, of course, things change. But when you're establishing that business model, that is the interpretive authority that we'll have when approving that business through their land use approvals. That if they have, it's almost flipped. You have an occasional business, you're a trip that is for maybe parents of the employees that don't qualify as participants, just as kind of a give back. That's not your primary plan for, typical users. So for something like that, this word primarily, again, this is when you're writing language, all these little elements have legal implications for our findings of facts when we're going through this process. But was there another one you wanted to highlight?
so I just wanted to, two things. First, from a practical perspective, there's no way we could police participants. There's just no way.
Yeah.
So then that leaves us with the use. And again, from the practical perspective, somebody comes in and says, I'm this use, it's got to be easy for us to say you are or you're not.
Yeah.
And I think primarily is the key word here. But if you took primarily out, then maybe these other groups would qualify. So is that a strong enough word? And is that enough for us to, what's the definition of that? Is it majority of their trips or whatever it is? But we need to be able to discern quickly and easily, and there needs to be a clear line. And that's one of the things we're struggling with. So.
I mean, it seems weird, but I feel like this is where a percentage basis could also, because you can look at NAC's trip schedule for the year. You can figure out what percentage of those trips are within this definition and what percentage don't. And we could say 85%, 90% of your endeavors have to be this that we're discussing here, allowing, like you said, for that occasional trip that's not maybe serving that mission directly in the same kind of way.
Like staff trips have their own.
Yeah, exactly.
Things like
that.
I think on that note, we get special use permits for a lot of the times that we operate, pretty much every time we operate in a national park.
Yep.
And those special use permits stipulate that we have to have a 1-to-1 ratio of people with a disability on the trip to people without a disability. So when we're running, we do a white rim bike trip that we just got approved. We kind of have to do it every single year. We have to get the same approval. Same thing when we run Cataract Canyon, but we're in that ratio of at least 50%, and it's most likely way more than that of our participants and total number of people on the trip have a disability. And that's the only reason that we can get all those permits and we can run so many rivers around the state.
Well, totally. And we're not even talking about a percentage of participants with a disability. We're saying a percentage of time spent serving this particular recreational therapy service provider role.
Yeah, or a percentage of trips each year that are dedicated to that.
Yeah, so it doesn't matter what your ratio of disabled people to able-bodied people is on that. So.
Okay.
Also, to some degree, I feel like that definition could be kind of flimsy, because if somebody ran a few trips that had that 1-to-1 ratio or whatever and could claim that they did that, even if they only did it twice a year, if we don't, I'd rather define it on how frequently or how much of your operation is made up of those trips. You know, saying that, 85 or 90% of all the trips that you do are, within this definition, that they are providing a service to people who need that service and who you like focus on, rather than defining it by how many like disabled folks versus able-bodied folks are on a trip. I feel like that's a little flimsier.
I do feel like we hit that 85 to 90% mark, the trips that we run that.
Can't hear that as well.
Yeah, sorry.
Not used to
This
this.
is Karen from
Hi.
NAC speaking.
This is Karen.
Oh.
I do feel like we come close and hit that 85 to 90% mark. The trips that we are running that aren't disability focused serve our mission in a way that it's trips that we are auctioning off for the highest bidder, who's then providing scholarship funds for the rest of our participants to be able to come. Do you feel like you agree with that, Jeff?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I'd want to be a little more, I'd want to do a little bit of analysis and give a little thought to the actual number, whether it's 85 or 90 or 80 or
Yeah, that was just
70.
thrown out as an
Yeah,
example.
but I think when you say primarily or majority, you get vastly above 50%. I think we'd feel pretty darn comfortable. So you say 75% or more or something of that sort. I mean, that would feel right, because as we go forward, if and when we're able to build this facility, we're going to be able to open up additional opportunities for hiking and for climbing, and we've got permits for canyoneering and some other things. So I would want to lock in a percentage that's high that would gate others out, but not put us in this weird situation where, well, we said it was 87% back in 2024, and now we're at 85, and we get in a big hullabaloo. So.
Yeah, we can give you time. We can give them time, and we can work on a staff level.
Oh,
just
yeah.
Find out what the reality is, and then go from there.
But I like that it gets out of Moab having to police who has a disability, which disabilities qualify. That's left up to us. But then primarily is more well defined, so it closes some gaps for other people, where primarily isn't a word that that can be interpreted, but 75% or more is not a word or a phraseology that can be interpreted. That means, hey, 75% of those trips, have at least one person or more with a disability, if the ratio doesn't lock things in.
Well, I am
So-
curious, going back to Michael's point, and also this point about, the city not having a policing role. I agree that the word primarily isn't specific enough and kind of leaves too much open to interpretation. But if we are setting, a specific percentage, or how can we get more specific while not causing like a business audit to be done by the
Yeah.
office,
That's an insightful point that I think, yes, absolutely. I think, again, when we've intentionally, picked this type of language, we can, not within this definition, maybe settle on number, but would almost be more appropriate within our development code to say, oh, if primarily is used anywhere else in our municipal code, here's generally what that means. But trying to define it subjectively to this use or in a particular way, we just went through another text amendment where we've seen uses that have packets and pages of use parameters and qualifications, and then some of those things like that may not be even feasible to actually achieve. So on paper, we feel like we're closing this gap. So I do, to a degree, while it was the applicant team and the staff's objective to put ourselves through that hacker mindset, I don't want us to get stuck into that so much, because we are the entity that's going to be approving these. That's not something that NAC needs to worry about. We are going to get, I think by the end of this, certainly a definition that we believe NAC fully qualifies for. So if we're making a suggestion to you of like, hey, I don't think we need that, it's not something that I think there needs to be too much of a battle on unless it immediately contradicts something that with it is within your mission. But this is when we're looking is long range for multiple users. And that's another thing we'll kind of get to with some of these other language pieces. But to your point, I feel comfortable with the word primarily. And if we have to have a legal conversation because some applicant comes in and they're pitching, I don't know, 46% or whatever they're going to say, or we go to their national mission website and it says nothing about these, they're like, oh no, but we are. Well, like Michael said, if we can't quickly and correctly determine that, well, then you don't qualify. It's kind of that simple.
Well, and it's one of those things where you know it when you see it, and we know NAC is it. And so we just need to get to a point where we can say when we know it's not it, that you can't do that.
Well, and this is my only concern, just because like if it's coming to here for us to figure out whether or not each applicant should have these conditional like zoning uses. I've found in recent times that language that can be interpreted a bit more tends to be a little bit dangerous. And when we're having to make administrative decisions, language that can be interpreted does allow people to make a case for things that we may or may not see as a good use of this code change. And so I would be inclined to use slightly more specific language than something like primarily, just so that we have a much more direct, like a much more direct decision-making process that doesn't allow for as much interpretation, because as we are administrative in a way, we are not really here to interpret so much as we are to, you know, focus on a definition. And so I'm of course wanting this definition to work with what you guys do, and knowing that like, yeah, we don't want to say 90% and then have you guys kind of hands tied into this position where you can't run a staff trip that has its own benefit because it would throw you out of that 90% ratio or whatever. Finding something that's reasonable makes perfect sense, but at the same time, having a little bit stronger of a definition there, I think protects us from having someone who comes out and is like, oh, I have 52%, that's primarily, that's more than half of my business. And it's like, well, is that really the spirit of what we're trying to do here? And I essentially would rather have something that doesn't allow that argument down the road.
Definitely. So I think as Michael said, we'll work with NAC to maybe get to the bottom of that for this group and then see how that applies.
Yeah.
A little bit more broadly. Perfect. I know we did backtrack to the initial banner use within that, but coming back to this ancillary use, shaking off the cobwebs a little bit, is that without this criteria piece for ADA, what we're basically looking at are four basic criteria. One is you're the participant, or you're caretaker for the participant, or a family member, meaning you're the facilitator, or a professional facilitator, which is the trainer, facilitator, counselor. So it's really it is the participant or the folks supporting that participant. That's really it. And then we have what is that last one, which is the full-time or part-time employee of that primary use. And we've added in and maintained, or the qualifying permitted use entity of another permitted primary use entity, meaning potentially a qualifying participant from a school, or excuse me, I'm so sorry, a employee of the school or an employee for CKID could also use that. So does maintain this community of employee housing in the off season of what the short-term qualification would be. So that's the four criteria that we can kind of try to wrap our minds around that's currently proposed. Any questions with that?
That seems to make a lot of sense to me. In regard to like, what we're trying to do is limit this use to the people who are involved in the program, whether they are the attendees or whether they are facilitating the program. In a way, if we kind of are stricter with the previous definition of whose programs are allowed to do this in the first place, then we don't have to be as incredibly strict with who within the program is allowed to use this opportunity. Because in a way, I would rather the city police control who is able to do this in the first place and what businesses are even able to offer this at all. and then do less oversight of exactly who's staying in that lodging. As long as they are employed or participating, that would make perfect sense to me that they would be able to use that housing.
Yeah, if we don't go down that more macro level, like I like what you just stated there, but if we don't, I would add volunteer in here as well, because as Corey was saying, anyone who's supporting those folks will have volunteers come. And if someone drives down for that, we wouldn't want them to have to go get accommodation somewhere else. But I like your thoughts on qualifying the NAC type entity, so then you can hold that entity responsible and you don't have to look at every little itty bitty thing and do audits on, you know, how many participants were on this trip that were disabled and how many weren't, and was this person really an employee? So yeah, I like that. It seems a lot more practical and doable.
I think the only thing I might bring up or clean up is if we do add volunteers and such. You know, it's one thing like a full-time employee is going to be there full-time and may use that, but a volunteer would, in a way, I feel like there's a loophole there where essentially, like, I would want some amount of language to say when the volunteer is staying there that they are actively working on a trip versus like language that allowed someone to be like, oh yeah, I volunteered for that trip 2 months ago and now I'm, you know, I am a volunteer for this or was a volunteer for this, so now I can stay here. I would rather like full-time staff makes perfect sense, participants make perfect sense, but some amount of language that says they are allowed that use during their time they're participating in the program, not outside of it, just because they are a potential volunteer, were a volunteer, or would be a volunteer in the future.
Yeah, I think we had talked about shoulders too, where you could come a little bit before and stay a little bit after.
Sure, yeah, because
But
that's important for
I
the
think that's a
program.
really good point.
Just wondering, an individual.
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. It's Courtney Kaiser speaking.
An individual attending an enrollment-based program could be the participant or it could be the volunteer. So
Sure.
maybe that already encompasses
I
those.
actually
That
feel like
covers
that
that, yeah.
encompasses
Okay.
it, to me. But one
yeah.
person, so.
Yeah, yeah, because if you guys have already approved for them to be on this trip, then yeah, whether it's family, maybe it's, you know, it's their best friend neighbor because they're not family, but they are their person who's volunteering.
Yeah,
Or a lot of
you know.
people have professional caregivers who would, you know,
And
and
it does have
stuff like that,
caregiver.
who are
Maybe the
volunteering their
trip too,
time.
honestly.
Yeah, and
Right,
Right.
right.
So yeah, I might dude, Michael and I are definitely from the staff perspective, but we do have kind of the two different perspectives of that. So it's nice to have both of us here. Is the volunteer language is what makes me really nervous from a
Yeah.
practical essence of business licensing and actual
Mhm.
enforcement. But I think the way Courtney has phrased it, that we're saying we do indeed believe that captures it, is attending an enrollment-based program. Again, pushes it back on the user.
Mhm.
Volunteer is a standalone. Again, kind of like what we were saying with the ADA qualification. It makes it a standalone thing. That maybe with this, it's kind of benign, but we got to think about CK or excuse me, I keep using the term. Any group homes or any schools of a volunteer basis may not be as altruistic, put it that way.
or is clearly defined, or their stay may not be as clearly
For
defined.
sure. So I think this, I would not venture any more language than what's here already within
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I'm curious if enrollment based is the right language, if we are thinking about other potential entities around town that could benefit from this. Like, I'm not really sure if there's legal implications of saying something like enrollment based program versus like individuals qualifying for program services or something like that. You know, like I can think of a couple organizations where I don't know if they have like a formal
Enrollment process.
process or whether enrollment has to be initiated by the individual versus the administrator.
Right.
I don't know, it just kind of stood out to me as like, is that the right?
Right. Again, how do we define enroll? Because that's exactly that is is there some level of exchange of service that you're paying for your service, even if it's diminished, or is it, anyway, that's a point taken. I think that's something that we should be reaching out to some of these other uses, some of the agents from these other uses is saying, how do your participants, so I think we'll go back to the record, the way you phrased it when you first said that, I think would be something that we wouldn't, I don't think we want to remove the idea of enrollment altogether. I think that's an important aspect, but adding to that enrollment as well as, or in addition to, or type of thing of participation. So thinking about a group home, for instance, yeah, you're not enrolling in that. You're there through a very specific circumstance.
Yeah.
But making that qualifying participation, I think was some of the language you used.
I mean, oh, go ahead, Mel. I was gonna say the last slide, the definition, I mean, some of the other entities we're talking about would not qualify as outdoor therapy providers. So that already sort of scales that out. So there's like room to be worked with there if there is the intent to have this potentially apply to some of our sort of long-term support service providers in the community, trying to make some sort of accommodation specific uses more available to them that maybe haven't before. You know, if you go back a slide, I guess there's
the word
they're not
recreational.
nonprofit recreational therapy service providers.
The schools and group homes.
Sea Haven wouldn't be,
Correct.
for
And that's
example.
what, that's originally, and this is maybe a bit confusing, we didn't touch on that. Originally, the application was kind of framed in a way that we were going to redefine all of these uses that were actually this use to get access to this ancillary component. So schools will no longer be schools. They'd be educational programs that are, or nonprofits or blah, 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 blah. And so what we decided to do is separate all these, and it's the only tying piece of the ancillary piece. So if we actually we'll go down what is to the next slide, is a different framing mechanism. So we'd go into the C3 or the C4 and say, under schools, we're not changing anything about you. We would have a use parameter within the framing that says you have access or ability to ancillary, this ancillary use for short-term lodging for qualifying participants. So again, it's fun to bring you along on this code brain of how these things work. But yeah, that was one of the mechanisms that we were sure to include in this new language. So I think that's resolved. Not all of these schools have to qualify into the same language they do.
Yeah.
This is why this is the bigger piece. Think about at the very top of the page, it's saying school or group home or hospital, and then how this applies. So even with that though, looking at some of these, would a nurse, if a hospital were to generate some housing for a nurse to come up from a different location or a provider, would they qualify? Well, I think they would, based on the very first provision. But then there's a lot of other provisions that may be for the hospital or group homes that we could add here, because again, this is shall meet one of the following criteria. So we're not doing all inclusive here.
So I've got a question. So with letting out these units to other qualified entities or uses, would that be, are you talking about that at a reduced rate? I mean, is it a benefit to those entities because it's cheaper than going to a hotel? Because it has the ADA accessibility? What's the?
I think the benefit, and Jeff, you can step in if I say anything wrong here, but I think the benefit would be just availability. So like the hospital, for example, they probably aren't going to be able to build some of this lodging on their property right now. But if NAC builds their building first, then there's a traveling doctor that could stay at NAC during the winter.
Sure. So
yeah, we were just trying to be good community partners and saying, look, there's shoulder seasons where people aren't going to recreate as often. And if there's a traveling nurse that the hospital doesn't have a place to stay, we offer them a room at cost or whatever, some very reasonable rate, not trying to gouge anybody or make a profit, but, just open it up to the community where it would make sense. And all of us would agree as humans to say, yeah, that's a good use. Let's allow that person to use that during that season that we're not going to be able to recreate because it's too hot, too cold, or whatever the case may be. That was just the thought. And if that's too complicated, we can write that out of the code. That was just the thought is, hey, we'd love to be good community partners. And when we don't have a full house, if someone else has a need for it, let's open that up, in the right way to the right folks.
think I will say, unfortunately, if you are profiting at all from that endeavor in any way, that's going to be a big headache. Effectively. think
Yeah,
about
that's
it.
why I said if we operated at cost, it costs us this
Yeah.
much to,
I think the city doesn't want to be in the business of like making sure that people are charging the right amount for whatever the lodging they're providing is. And I think ultimately that would still be at the end of the day, opening up paid short-term lodging. Doesn't matter who it's for, it still would be using your property for something that otherwise is very much not allowed in our code after a very recent code revision for a very good reason. And I feel like there are many people in the community who would love to open up their spare bedroom or their back building as a short-term lodging for someone who works at the hospital who are not permitted to do so under our current code. And so my initial inclination is that totally agree that that's a super cool use, but I think if there's any sort of payment being had, it still would be sort of an unfair kind of allowance for something that I think we'd have rooms for nurses till the cows come home if we allowed people to do that in larger scale. But we still don't. So that's kind of
yeah, you have headaches. We have no idea what those headaches would be. So, if we're opening up a door that we should slam shut, just let us know. Hey, no, that nice thought, but we can't allow that because others.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are definitely homes in town that are not in overnight accommodations overlay zones that are donated for things, essentially as short-term rental. And I know that does not run afoul of our code where it's like, hey, you want to host a dinner here and put people up here for your nonprofit or whatever, you're welcome to. But I think the minute you're accepting payment for that, it becomes a short-term rental business in some way. And so that to me kind of seems like the distinction. But I get not wanting them to stay empty. I really do. I certainly understand that. And I also understand not having the ability to just like allow people to use your property for free for a million reasons. So we're not saying that like that is something you should have to do. Yeah, there's so many. We have like the definitional things that are sort of getting sussed out. Are there other levels I'm just thinking about like time, place, and manner, right? We've got the manner. Do we have specific sideboards on like time and place? Because I feel like those are also needed because I still think there are very many entities I can think of that meet this definition that maybe all of a sudden you've got like wilderness therapy programs. We've got a ton in town. Do we want to open the door to wilderness therapy programs having lodging on site before and after trips for the participants in those programs? Do we want to do this for, there's like Outward Bound, like there's a bunch of entities I think that are already here, have a business presence who would probably meet these criteria. Yeah. And do we want the door to be that wide or do we want it to have to be like, and in the C3 and something, maybe put some more restrictions on it?
I think so. I mean, that's what we have talked about. We've talked about a couple of strategies regarding that. And so having a couple levels of limitations is probably the right way to go.
I think that currently is framed. Right now, I believe in the packet, this is only being applied to the C3 at this moment. Is that right? Or it was C3 and other. We're looking at it C3. Okay.
To accomplish NAC's goal.
It's C3. But for the hospital example, we might include C2 or maybe C4 or wherever else makes sense for us where these other banner uses would be existing. But like you're saying, that continues to open the door more and more. This is where, it becomes a very tricky, worthwhile discussion pre-public hearing. I did misspeak earlier about an employee from somewhere else would be qualifying as an employee, not as an enrollment person of the hospital. You're not enrolled in the hospital. You're an employee of the hospital. That's why you can have the employee. Yep. So I want to rephrase. I misspoke. But yes, I think in the original application, you might have even recognized that there was another component here that's, I think we kind of both applicant team and staff recognized it might get a little too dicey, even more so than the one we're talking about now, which was to have participants also staying. So Sea Haven, for example, or I'm so sorry, group homes having their participants come and stay at NAC, for example. That became a little too dicey.
Yeah.
Where I think we all agreed that might be a little too much, but employees, as far as that short-term stay was concerned, made a little bit more sense for at least the discussion purposes. And then I do want to maybe get even to the next slide. So these are, again, the different uses we're analyzing. But this is a nice segue into what is the last piece, if my computer will go. Yeah, it's right here, is the use parameter that would accompany that short-term lodging, which is to say, and these are two pieces I think that are worthwhile noting, is forgetting how this is tied to employees. Well, it's long-term stay. So units may be rented for long-term for the qualifying participants. Now that is a little bit different than I think some of the original design that we had. So this is relatively new to staff to even tease out. But we're looking at two things here. One is that we're opening these up for long-term. And then the second is in how and which they would be constructed. There was a draft that was a working draft between the applicant team where we had talked about, and it was brought up about needing to, maybe it was Michael that said it.
If it was good, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think it was. These structures needing to comply with the underlying zone dwelling requirements, whatever that might be. I think it was Courtney at the intro.
Yeah.
And maybe, yeah, let's refresh on why that might be an issue here.
Right. So the C3 doesn't allow long-term housing on the ground floor unless you meet some specific requirements. So the goal with this verbiage was to say, okay, maybe this isn't long-term for just anybody, because that's the purpose of the C3 verbiage that Michael was getting at with saying following the underlying zone. And so trying to stay in that flavor, saying it can only be rented long-term to a qualifying entity or qualifying person.
So
does that close the door enough?
And so, yeah, that was a bit of a hybrid where we were having this issue before of it can be rented long-term to anybody. Well, then it should just qualify with the dwelling requirements. Well, that actually might make it harder for the original intent, which was it needs to be on the ground floor. One of the solutions to that was go into the C3 zone, which I have pulled up if we want to go look at it. But only has three basic levels to which dwellings on the ground floor would be permitted. And they're basically employee housing, HOSU or Housing Authority qualified restriction. I think it's those two, and then some other conditions. So what we could have done is within the original language, just tweak the C3 because that doesn't exist in any other zone. Dwellings can be permitted in all these other zones on the ground floor if they have a permanent foundation or some other kind of more form-based things. But this is the only zone that really has that issue. So rather than maybe tweaking this ancillary use parameter, tweak the zone. That almost might be easier. But what Courtney's done is say, well, if the participants are locked in that much, all we're saying is that you can go past 30 days with what you were already doing less than 30 days. So that's a pretty low bite. I think I'm okay with that. It's just, does that to our housing crisis, discussion is we've closed the door, I think, enough. The answer is, do we want to creep it back open a little bit, or are we just happy it being where it's at with this definition? Does that make sense for everyone? I said a lot of stuff.
Well, so I was actually curious about essentially duration in general. And I felt that in some way, I thought some amount of language in regards to the short-term lodging that says that you can only offer short-term lodging to folks for the duration of their time in the program, and being really clear about that if we're going from short-term to long-term, you can offer long-term to a wider group of folks, allowing you to house your guides, house, caretakers, this, that, and the other, but that it's almost stricter when you're just offering the short-term, that they have to be currently in a program to qualify to stay there for less than 30 days. If we're specific about that, then creeping the door open a little bit for long-term, allowing staff and long-term participants here to have a little bit more flexibility would honestly sounds good to me. Like the idea that you can provide a little bit more for your staff, but be very strict about essentially preventing someone from taking advantage of it and, having people stay short term, even though they're not currently part of a program. I think making sure that that's, even if they're enrolled in one in the future or whatever, that their short-term stay is during the duration of their program, that their long-term stay can come outside of that duration, but has to be 30 days or more.
So, I think maybe talking about whether you're going to allow ancillary uses to stay on the property is probably the big point. And then if you are then talking about, because that's when we're talking about long-term lodging, we're talking about the ancillary uses, right? Because in the C3, you can already put employees on the ground floor, right?
Which maybe is a question for you, Jeff. If the long-term housing would only be used for employees, then we stick with the verbiage that Michael had, because that's allowed in the C3 already.
Yeah, there's two thoughts in my head. So in our main campus, we've got a lodge, and we'll bring groups in for the lodge. But we also train athletes. We had 10 athletes that have trained with the NAC at one point in time, compete in the Beijing Winter Olympics. And so we'll have an athlete stay overnight. Now, we don't currently foresee us training athletes out of this facility, but maybe there's a kayaking Olympic adaptive situation. Tracy's going to go crazy. Or there's a rock climber or something. It just gives us some of that ability to accommodate that in the future. The other thing is we currently have a guide house. And we do have our guides stay there for the season. So I don't know how that would factor into the annexation, and if I should just shut my mouth and I'm opening up a can of worms of some sort. But that's currently something that we've been doing for years and years and years in a house next to the boathouse down there. So I don't know if that has to be factored in. It's a different building than this one. So
the other thought I had was maybe we're getting in the weeds too far. If we're saying they primarily provide these services, then you can have the kayaking team or whatever it was come and stay there, because as long as you're still providing the primary use to.
That's true. They're training.
Exactly. So maybe maybe we don't need to define it that much, as long as you stick to the primary use, and then, but we're still on long term. Is that something that the commission wants to consider outside of staff?
I mean, I think for me, it all comes back to making sure that initial definition of who is allowed to do this in the first place is as strong as it can be. Then, allowing your athlete team to be there doesn't seem to be a whole lot different use than allowing your participants to stay there for a short period of time, or allowing your guides to be in a guide house, which they already are and are already allowed to do. So it doesn't seem all that different to me. I wouldn't be too against it.
Right, because we would have determined that they are appropriate for our programming. And so it's still that qualified user group, no matter if it's this, which we will not have some random kayaker competitive team, just for the record, but but whatever that may be, it would still fall under the qualifying programming and participant base to fall within our mission and our focus. So
I might to maybe do a little mental jump, because obviously we're focusing around NAC, but imagining a different use in a different zone. For example, we're all very familiar with the C4 zone development requirements. They're quite odd and they're quite extensive. Color, form, height, all those things, which have some similar tweaks to this. Additional setbacks for them. Maybe that's a great way to say it. Long-term dwellings in this zone have greater setbacks than maybe what some of the other requirements are for other uses. So if we were developing in that zone under this banner use, they would not fall under the use parameters for multi-household or any other type of household. So they could build to a 0 lot line setback and then be used long-term. So if we're okay with that, which I think I am, because again, the primarily dedicated use, however we should say that, is going to be prevailing. So this not only ancillary use, but even the auxiliary off chance aspect of that is going to be so minute. Are we hung up on that for any of these uses in any of our zones? This one is particularly odd in the C3, but all the other ones are kind of more where I'm framing is we can kind of put NAC on the side for a second and say, is that okay?
I think the biggest thing with any sort of housing use in commercial zones is that, you know, I think rightfully, and I will say this is one of the bigger housing advocates, I think, in existence in town, is that we also want to protect our very precious and few commercial use spaces for commercial uses. I think that's something that we've heard not just from the business community, but also just town in general, that it's really hard to find housing. It's really hard to find a storefront. It's really hard to find office space. It's really hard to find commercial kitchen. That's one we come back to a lot. So I think in the context of anything expanding anywhere else in the C zones, we want to make sure that we are not inherently elevating any sort of residential use over the commercial use. Because we never know where things go, and that could, you know, and we'll continue to sort of have dwindling commercial space with that in mind. I don't think this would run the risk of that.
Right.
But
I think that
that's
is a
just
good
kind of
test.
the thing
And I think
to
we're
keep
on
in mind.
the positive side of that test, because that is kind of what we're doing.
Yeah, totally. But I also think you're going to have way less issues with neighborhood issues and concerned adjacent properties if you're in the C zones, which is what's kind of ironic. So it's, you know, kind of could walk that delicate balance. I think you're going to have a lot less problem if you've got participants staying on your property in units that you've built there specifically for that purpose. If you're, you know, if you abut businesses or hotels, or, you know, where your property is now, that aren't just houses in a neighborhood. I don't necessarily share that concern, but it's definitely something we hear from the community a lot. So
I think too that this is again, maybe getting a little bit into the weeds. And again, if we're in the bigger basis, but we do also have this rewrite coming up, that what I'm referencing is as if this rewrite were going to happen, is I'm trying to work within this realm of what our code is existing and to prevent any problems. But we're going to be able to resolve a lot of these weird elements in other commercial zones that I'm kind of trying to posture against. And that's almost a frame of habit that I'm doing that of, well, if obviously we want this to make sense, whether we move forward with the update or not. But I think some of my concerns will be eliminated bigger picture. So it was a good exploration of this, but I think I'm satisfied, and I've got good notes on this, I think. Okay. This last slide and we've worked through it. We kind of went out of where I was assuming we were going to go with this conversation, which was perfect. It was a little bit more natural. So these were just highlighting concepts of what I'll call our draft concept plan that we were working back and forth with the applicant team on that weren't brought through in this most recent application. So the complexity of the permitted use definition, exclusionary language, maybe not being necessary. So to kind of put a more finer point on it, Kaya brought it up already, is the nonprofit element of that term. It just may not be necessary for the city's purposes. I know, again, it was the applicant team trying to be as descriptive and selective as possible. It just might not matter for us. So that might be something we recommend either in line with the applicants or as we move forward to the public hearings, maybe slightly different language where we feel it's going to work more universally with where we're going with it. And then under the ancillary use criteria, broader qualifying language with specific to NAC may not be necessary. This was the ADA requirement, so we've already hit on that. Ancillary use parameter, additional qualifications that structures shall comply with underlying zone requirements if used for long-term rental, complex solution options possible. We just talked about that. So I commend you all for thinking like planners and using your code brain. So I feel we've met all the description pieces that we were needing to cover tonight. I I don't think there's anything in my other PDFs that we need to show. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing screen.
Corey, can I ask you a question really quick?
Of course.
So I wonder if you could explain how this would work if this were to be adopted and NAC were to come in and apply under the zone. They would apply for site plan and go forward and the architectural plans, which would have the units in them and everything. They'd build that. And that's a land use. The use is approved. That runs with the land.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
Okay. So, but in order to operate those, they would also have to have a business license showing that they meet this use. Is that correct?
Correct. Well, very similar to, say, a hotel, for example. There's a permitted use within the zone. It is permissive, and then they have land use requirements to build it out. But then to actually get their C of O and occupy, they will have to have liquor license or, whatever additional licensing with the city, same as everyone else. So that's, with these guys, would be just typical. Yeah.
Okay. So in 10 years, they sell it. It doesn't give the rights to the person who bought it the ability to have short-term rentals there unless they also met that other criteria.
Right. So if it was also a recreational therapy service provider that moved in, great. It's all set up for you. It's perfect.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're having to renew use or a use change, which happens pretty frequently, less so in bigger, more complex structural projects, but it does happen. So we see retrofitting of hotels into apartments. We see other things like that where the permitted use is changing, and also all of those requirements have to change. So they are having to make improvements, whether that is decommissioning things or improving things. So this would be one of those where you'd probably end up with a nifty employee housing situation. But again, that's why we were wanting to
I like
ensure that the housing, if again, outside of their use, we have to look not only long-term, but even longer term than that, is once NAC is gone, because it's going to be gone at some point. What is this structure, if it survives, going to serve?
Yep.
And is it going to meet those needs? So that was, again, where I think some of Michael's original language secured that it would carry through within the zone, because it wasn't specific to, it said not, to get to a point, notwithstanding the underlying zone requirements, which basically says, yeah, whatever the requirements of the zone are at the time of the change, that's what you have to meet, which is typical for our code. So it's maybe something that we can revisit with the team and make sure we are baking in those long-term plans. But I do feel with the use that Courtney's put out, the use parameter Courtney's put out, it files in the net use piece pretty nicely. Yeah, good. That was a good discussion.
To some degree, just a question though. So obviously they have to be in compliance with all the things we've just talked about at the time to have this use. But how often is that, or is there even a mechanism for that to be like checked up on? If we said that, primary use meant 70% of their trips had to be, this particular use, and that's what allowed them this nightly rental, short-term rental ability. How often is that determined? Could somebody come in and do the application and go through the paperwork to say, yes, we do more than 70% of our trips are for this. And then, businesses change, things evolve, right? What stops someone from stopping offering this particular use and still providing nightly rentals, or falling below that 70%, doing a bunch more paid trips and, scaling back their, trips with folks with disabilities down to 30%. And would they, how is that maintained, and would they be able to essentially get away with offering these nightly rentals and becoming more of a nightly rental company than they were, what they were initially proposing when they put in their application?
Sure. This is not a permissive statement, but there is no way to stop them from doing that. But there is a way to regulate going forward. The best analogy I have for this is once you get a C of O for a home, a building, the minute you get that C of O and you get the keys and you walk in that door, you close that door, you can take a sledgehammer to all the supporting beams and we won't know. At a certain point though, an assessor, a change of ownership, a change of business license, a change of an improvement or remodel, those are incremental review at,
Sure.
review schedules in which we would do these analysis. So in the scope of operations, that's where within the business license, we are becoming far more sophisticated at that, is factoring into the business license, all of those elements. So if it's not even within the use parameters,
So it's
within
not
the
a land
code,
use thing, but
the
every time
use
we
can be,
submit
can
that
be
business
restricted
license.
that way. And so if it comes down to a compliance realm, I don't know if Michael wants to
Yeah,
expand on compliance.
I think it
but-
was a great explanation. I mean, yeah, somebody could get away with it for a little while.
Mhm.
But there's that built-in check where through the business license, we have the ability to look at that. So.
Sure.
Yeah, Facebook I mean, it's a small town.
Mhm.
And so even outside of, what is our normal standard compliance, which could be complaints, it could be a series of things. It's pretty small town. So, if that's what we do see and
Some
we,
screenshots go.
Yeah.
Yeah,
exactly.
we- that-
This is what I'm wondering. is that
advertising, Explore going,
If we
Cancun,
see
blah, blah, blah.
Explore on VRBO.
We'll say, hey, guys,
How do we make
what,
sure that-
Can't use that as an enforcement mechanism. Thank
what's
you,
going
Stan.
on? And then it spurs additional conversations and restructuring of those kind of things. So, and that's not uncommon for every use. I know that's kind of weird
Curious
to
if we're
say, but
opening a door, I want to know how far we're cracking.
For
it
sure.
and how
That's
to make
right.
Sure.
that's right.
It's being used for its intended purpose.
Yeah. I would say this would not be abnormal than what we normally deal with, but that is an example of what we do deal with constantly.
Yeah, I think all of this makes good sense. I think my biggest concern is really just like you said, opening the door within qualifying uses a touch too wide to entities, businesses, organizations who might not have the same very specific needs. But it might just be slightly more convenient for their business to be able to have everybody meet them at their office and then stay there and then take off on the trip when they've been operating under a different model for a very long time, but hotels are more expensive now. And wouldn't it be great if they could do the same thing? I don't want to do that because I think that door goes real wide real quickly. And you could have some pretty sort of like wild uses that could fall under that. I think that like nobody would potentially want, but trying to figure out, how that works. So just making sure that, because I think Explore has or National, I'm doing it too now. Thanks, Corey. NAC has a very specific use mission where you really do have the ability access constraints of doesn't matter how many hotel rooms are available in Moab at what price at a certain point. If all of the ADA accessible ones are filled, like you're out of luck. So it really is such a smaller pool. It's not just like kids who are coming to meet wilderness therapy program, staying a night with their parents before they, kick off their program, meeting their counselors or their trip leaders. They just don't have the same kind of constraints. Even financial, I actually don't think the financial constraint is enough to warrant this. I know it's huge. I know that's something that Sea Haven, for example, comes up against all the time when they have to provide hotel rooms for people who are seeking shelter. It's a huge burden on that organization. So, but I think that alone, it's the availability thing, I think really is the biggest component to me, and sort of carving that out. It's like you all are seeking the ability to provide this super specific thing that, yes, will not just serve people who have mobility aids. There will be people who, do not need the ADA shower who are using these units. But I think the biggest reason seems to be that. So.
I think also to speak to that, this is Karen. I think also to speak with that, the standard of ADA rooms across the board just varies so much. Brian had a recent example where he was calling a hotel to ask about their accessible rooms, and the gentleman said, "Oh, they're all accessible." And he's like, "No, I need this. Like, I need a roll-in shower. We have 6 participants, using wheelchairs. We need a roll-in shower." He's like, "Oh, it's roll-in." It's like, no, there's a lip on it. You can't roll into a shower if there's a lip on it. So what the NAC is really focused on doing is going above and beyond ADA standards and really creating, the lodge up north is a beautiful lodge, and we have like sensory rooms.
Yeah.
And just a variety of things. Like we want to think about it from all angles and not just like, okay, how do we meet the basic the
course.
box square? We're not putting people in square boxes. We have a variety of participants. We want to be able to cater to all of them. And that I don't feel like that's what a lot of hotel rooms do. It's like check a box sometimes.
Yeah.
So
The bare minimum.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like technical
Mm-hmm.
accessibility versus actual accessibility.
Versus
Yeah, Courtney, come
comfort.
on up.
Sure.
So just an overarching question, would this be more or less palatable to y'all if we didn't include all the other uses? And then other uses could come and request a similar change as needed?
My gut reaction is that asking for what you all specifically need, and then maybe that sets a precedent that then can then be modeled or expanded once sort of the holes are figured out, once it's like almost the test case, right? Not a conditional use, to be clear.
Right.
But kind of like figuring out what it is you all actually need, and then that's the model for something else. You don't want to like throw the baby out with the bathwater inadvertently by trying to have it be long-term housing, by trying to have it be meeting the hospital's needs or something like that. I don't know. I think it is muddying the waters a little bit. Frankly.
Yeah.
And y'all also have all of this land use code stuff coming up. So
Yes.
maybe this is the
Yes.
test case that then could be rolled into those rewrites.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Or
Okay.
saying like, hey, this is something that NAC is doing. Here's the small tweak that we need as this service provider. How do we make that happen? How do we open that up? Or how do we make sure we fit into the definition that they're using? I think that's much easier than trying to like meet similar but still pretty disparate criteria all at once right now, would be my feeling. But I'm one person on the commission, so.
I mean, I agree. And I think like, with the overarching concern of how much do we crack the door, like if yours becomes a precedent, but other people still have to walk through this process and show why, or, exactly what little revisions need to be made for their particular use, just like you are going to show what, revisions need to be made for your particular use, it will give us an easier chance to look at each person trying to do something like this and ensure that they are doing it in the right way and in a way like, I commend you wanting to make something that other nonprofits and other people helping the community can use. But it does make things a little bit more difficult, and the precedent you'll set if this all works out anyways can be very useful to them in the first place without you having to extend yourself to ensure that places like the hospital or that group homes are also allowed to do this kind of thing right off the bat.
Thank you.
What I might offer with that, and we've done this before, is it sounds like the applicant team is probably going to likely be moving that direction, is as we approach our public hearing or even what will likely be on the city council, is kind of a little bit more of a palette of options. We have the refined code, it's polished, but within that, the essence of the public hearing, hopefully we get a lot of response from the community that may address some of these other uses that, because it's hard to tell. We don't know if these additional uses, schools, group homes and hospitals would make it more enticing to bring this on board or less enticing, muddying the waters, for example. So we're not sure. The council might say, no, that actually makes it more of a bite. I will say of the uses, those are certainly the more secured as far as credentials for approval for business. For example, a hospital is not something you just go out and build. Well, Jen might disagree with that, but and group home certainly kind of not of the same nature either. And then school is certainly a totally different animal as well. So all of those, the NAC or the recreational therapy service provider is kind of what is the most challenging one of those. So I almost see dropping them, maybe sixes in my mind, but we can keep them as a palette of tool options where we have just this code amendment, just NAC, just this ancillary option, and then this easy component, which is, we could add this to these other uses in these other zones.
Yeah.
If you'd like.
I would almost say like, maybe it makes the most sense not to say, okay, we're not gonna do any of that now or discount that, but to figure out precisely what works for what NEC needs in a vacuum, and then take that and see if it's applicable, rather than trying to have everything on the top initially as you're trying to even just figure out whatever it looks like for y'all. That might be, and then if that fits within that, there's small tweaks you can make to open it up, it is, but trying to sort of like have all those criteria from the start might kind of confuse everything, frankly.
I think we're in pretty good shape, because again,
Yeah.
all we're looking at is 2 types of uses, one ancillary, one permitted, with the corresponding definitions, and then 4 criteria points. It's not that, I know there was a lot we
Yeah.
went through, but it really isn't that terribly complex. But I think this has been a tremendous discussion. I've got a lot
Pages.
to go through, which is just really great. I expect nothing less from you guys, nor our applicant team. They've been great as well. So I feel we're coming to a conclusion here. So any other comments from commission before we end this item?
No.
Okay, well, thank you. I'll conclude my presentation piece on it.
We've had a very interesting season on planning commission. We've had a lot more of this in the last like 6 months than we ever have before. It's cool.
It's new water.
Trying to figure out how to fit things where they need to fit and how. And like, I mean, Courtney, your presentations are always fantastic, but that was just like so wonderful. And thanks to everybody from NAC for really just like allowing us to see into why this is important, both to people that, you know, use your trips and staff, and then also to the community here in town too. So, and Karen, thank you. And city staff, that was excellent. Thank you.
Thanks for making the time for us. I know this was probably not your typical length of a discussion for something, so we appreciate the insights.
You know, you would say that, but we've had some
Well-
real cons this year. But this was
I-
for like good reason. This was
Right?
like, let's figure out how to make something cool work, which is different than some of those long discussions sometimes. So,
It's awesome.
Yeah, so
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
yeah, thanks
Thank
y'all.
you for what you do.
All right, future agenda items, staff folk, what do we got?
I'll look to Anna and Bryce to help me out with this, but it's likely that we'll have a minor subdivision.
Okay.
Before you, and I've been mentioning this for a couple weeks, and we're still in that DRT mode of
Thanks, y'all.
shoring up some of the development details. So a minor subdivision for recommendation. Annexation is coming through the process.
Ooh, where?
And
What annexation?
It's on 191, right next to
I think it's, yeah,
Fedigo, right?
1082 South,
Highway 191.
and you may, yeah, it's titled Shumway Annexation. It's a mixed use.
Okay.
Mixed use development on the highway.
Cool.
Right. Mixed commercial use, yeah. Anything else off the top? I feel like there was one more we were kind of on the bubble for. Oh, thank you. Yes, that's exactly right. Well, condominium, Cottonwood Condominiums is coming back through for the condominiumization of their site plan approval.
Be happy when we never see that development
So
again.
they will be back, to ownership divide. And then what was the other comment?
It was an approval that was done administratively, it was 4 units. So it's townhome style.
Right. Thank you. So that would be a recommendation that will end up going to city council for a 4-unit townhome development. One of the waybacks, just across the road here. Formerly the Auburn townhomes now. Well, we'll get to that later.
Okay.
But yeah, so we do have some coming for you. 25th, I believe.
Yeah, 25th.
Thank you. Michael, anything else from?
Well, I
admin
just
or
say
anything
get
else?
ready because our consultants are working hard on the
They
code
are.
amendments and, well, the code update, which is a big rewrite,
Yeah.
to update. And we will be spending a lot of time on that this probably late summer and fall.
Okay. And then Carolyn, do you want to ask your like questions you were shooting me today?
Yeah, it was kind of just that, like what to expect in terms of our participation or our role in the code update process, and to what extent, we should be like proactive about things versus kind of waiting for them to come in front of us.
Yeah, so right now we'll have to wait. We're all waiting right now because we don't have any materials yet. What you can be proactive in is if you know of issues that you'd like to address,
Yeah.
that you'd like to bring up to the consultants, those are things you can get to Corey and I right now. And we will be setting up more meetings coming up. Kaya participated previously with the consultants, and we'll try to get more involvement as we go along. But a lot of it is going to be as we feed them information and get them things, and as they do community meetings and they find out where it is we're heading, plus being consistent with state code, right? All of those things, they will produce documents, and then there will be a lot of review and a lot of discussions. I mean, we discussed a lot tonight on one thing. Oh, which was great. This was a great discussion.
Can we be preemptively tired?
Yeah.
Choir,
You mean
preaching in a choir. Yeah, I
I
am
think there's
excited.
gonna
I am
be a
thrilled.
our plan is not to have a lot of groundbreaking new things in
For
the
sure.
update. But I do think there are a few things that will take some time to discuss.
Mhm.
But the majority of the work will be just reviewing and making sure you agree with the way things are written.
Totally.
So,
But like, if there's like, example, but like, if there's just a weird spot zone somewhere, that should probably be flagged that someone noticed, or something that could like benefit from a change in the underlying zone in the context of this. Would that be?
Could be.
something?
I think we may not be, I think like Mike was saying, we're looking at the existing content of the code and shoring it up.
Yep.
So looking at reestablishing zoning districts might be
Yep.
part 2 of this.
Yeah,
So
okay.
not at this time, but maybe following the downtown master plan. So it's worth noting.
Mhm.
And then potential elements we can bake into now to fixing the code.
Yeah.
So whenever that does come along, it's just gonna be an alignment of
Yeah.
how we're gonna reestablish zone districts. Is that fair to say?
yeah, it's a never ending process.
Oh, of course.
Right? By the time we get down with the reestablishment of zone districts, we'll be ready for a code revision update. It's all that. So it really, yeah, if you're looking for job security, some of our code,
And then we'll have a
code
general
consultants
plan
are,
update as
Oh,
well.
yeah.
yeah,
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 town master
yeah.
Oof. Corey, that's so cynical.
What's that?
Just by the time one thing's done and the next
It's-
one will be up for.
Oh, that's, yeah, it's amazing how quickly,
Oh, yeah.
Anna's done some incredible work archiving zoning maps, zoning ordinances and zoning title updates since what, the 30s, 60s, 50s for sure.
Cool.
Starting.
But incredible to see the growth. Also, what was some of the really insightful zoning that's still around that was in from the 50s. We still have zoning districts in the same places they were from the 50s.
Oh,
But
yeah.
it'll also speak
Oh,
to the
I
fact
know.
of, I think it's time we kind of look at those and maybe grow a little bit.
Yes.
Where we've met some of those growing pains. But yeah, the growth we've experienced in the last, what I call 7 years, maybe even
Yeah.
branching to 10, is pretty substantial. So it's, there's normal rates of, oh, we're going along the path and general plans meeting what it meets. But we've taken some pretty hard turns
Yeah.
that we need to catch up.
Yeah, we're
to.
no longer like throwing uranium adit waste underneath our
Yeah.
homes in old Moab anymore.
Things like that.
So, things.
Things like that. So no, it's not cynical. It's optimistic that you always have the ability to renew.
Yeah.
We are a bunch of phoenixes.
Well, I'm planning, and I frankly, the idea that we have cyclical planned updates of various things, I think it just keeps everything
Mhm.
relevant,
Yeah.
because I mean, when I sat down with the consultants for half an hour, the biggest point of conversation was just, we've got some stuff that has not been changed in 30 years that should have been changed 29 years ago, like that kind of stuff. And that's really a headache. It's a huge source of headaches. We're playing catch up a lot on stuff. So hopefully we'll get to a place where that's not the case anymore.
In the planning world, it's forever is like 7 to 10 years.
Yeah.
So when that would never happen. Just wait 7 to 10 years. Usually things change
God,
quite a bit.
having lived in Moab for 9 years. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's why we need to keep on this.
Get that.
cyclical thing, so.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you, city staff. Like, this was a great discussion. Meeting adjourned at 8:04 p.m.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
That was a great discussion.
Yeah.
Very.
Corey said tremendous.